Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we'll drift into the strange world of Renaissance medicine, when doctors wore feathered hats, bled their patients with gentle optimism, and believed, quite sincerely, that puffing dried leaves through a wooden pipe could cure just about anything, from headaches to heartbreak. Yes, we're talking about tobacco, not as a vice, but as nature's most flavorful miracle cure. So fluff your pillow, settle your mind, and prepare to enter a time when taking a deep breath might be followed by doctor's orders. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Let's begin with smoke. It was the year 1492, and somewhere in the gently sun-baked Caribbean, two puzzled sailors from the Santa Maria watched in bewilderment as indigenous Taino islanders took long, serene pulls from rolled tobacco leaves. The Spaniards, naturally, did what any sensible explorer would do upon observing a serene stranger exhaling fragrant mist from their nose. They decided it must be medicinal, and so began one of the most peculiar experiments in global health history. By the time tobacco leaves reached Europe, they were greeted with the warm enthusiasm usually reserved for saints and soup. Sailors, physicians, noblemen, and occasionally even goats, although not by choice, were all exposed to the new craze. The first published descriptions came from the ever-adventurous chroniclers of conquest, who claimed the leaves calmed the soul, cleared the lungs, invigorated the blood, and, this is my favorite, fortified the loins. The exact mechanism of loin fortification, sadly, remains undocumented. The real breakthrough, though, came when French ambassador Jean Nicot, yes, the man whose name would later be immortalized in nicotine, sent crushed tobacco leaves to Queen Catherine de' Medici around 1560. She'd been suffering brutal migraines, the kind only a 16th century French queen could describe with flair. Like 1,000 tiny glass horses dancing on my skull. After she sniffed the ground-up tobacco like crusty herbal glitter, her headaches reportedly vanished. Naturally, this led the French court to reach the perfectly logical conclusion that tobacco was a divine panacea. It was promptly christened herbe à la reine, or the Queen's herb, which sounds lovely, until you realize people also called henbane the Queen's crop. Royal branding didn't come with health guarantees. Suddenly, every upper-crust European with a pulse and a monocle wanted a tobacco prescription. Doctors, those beacons of Renaissance certainty, began prescribing tobacco for everything under the sun. Gout, melancholy, excessive thinking, insufficient thinking, stomach cramps, plague prevention, and occasionally rain-related sadness. Pharmacists, in powdered wigs and serious faces, began preparing delightful tobacco remedies, tinctures, pastes, snuff, candles, enemas. Yes, enemas. One 17th century English medical text recommended blowing tobacco smoke directly into the rectum of a drowning victim to revive them. Entire kits were developed for this purpose, sold with all the casual confidence of a modern pool toy. They were called, and I promise this is real, tobacco smoke bellows. Let's pause a moment to imagine that. You're an earnest riverside physician. You've just pulled a half-drowned man from the Thames. He's unconscious. You whip out your trusty tobacco resuscitation kit, complete with bellows, pipe, and a generous pouch of Virginia's finest, and prepare to quite literally blow smoke where the daylight doth not shine, all in the sacred name of healing. Medicine, after all, is a mysterious art, but in tobacco's defense, it did feel magical. The way smoke curled and danced in the crisp morning air, how a single puff seemed to clear the weary head and soothe the rumbling gut. All sensations people mistook for healing. And in a time when surgical instruments looked like torture art, any plant that didn't kill you outright was considered a godsend. No wonder people smoked it from sunrise to sundown with medicinal pride. Cities soon scented of dried leaves and roasting fires, and tobacco shops popped up like dandelions. Gentlemen with velvet cloaks exchanged pipe techniques the way we now share smoothie recipes. Even monks, supposedly committed to inner peace and outer silence, took to smoking in cloisters, thoughtfully of course, between vespers and naps. Of course, not everyone was sold on the idea. Some skeptical scholars whispered concerns about lung melancholy and tepid humours, but such critics were politely ignored or encouraged to sniff more vigorously. And so, tobacco twirled its smoky fingers through palaces, apothecaries and public parks, hailed not as a vice, but as vaporous salvation. But why stop at headaches and fainting spells? In our next dreamy ramble, we'll meet a London physician who believed tobacco smoke might cure the bubonic plague. One wheeze at a time. The smoke that saved the Queen's cough picture, if you will, the year 1580. A time when corsets were tight, courtiers were tighter, and smallpox was the sort of thing that popped up uninvited to every royal gathering, like that cousin who insists on singing show tunes at weddings. Amid the lace ruffs and feathered hats of Elizabethan England, whispers of an enchanted plant from the New World drifted through the draughty halls of power. Tobacco. To us, it's now something we politely avoid in restaurants, but back then, it was whispered about with the awe you'd reserve for a unicorn that could balance your humours and find your missing sock. The good Queen Elizabeth I ruled with a firm hand, and occasionally a ticklish throat. Sir Walter Raleigh, the man who practically made pipe smoking fashionable, was credited not only with bringing potatoes and a moodier kind of poetry to England, but with offering up the miraculous leafy answer to all that royal respiratory unease. Legend has it, and in boring history secrets, we always honour legends, especially the sleepier ones, that Queen Elizabeth once suffered a persistent cough after one of those long, damp English banquets. The kind with 4 courses of roast pheasant and fewer vegetables than a pirate's lunchbox. A court physician suggested all the usual suspects, a mixture of dandelions, powdered hedgehog hoof, and very stern prayer. But nothing worked. Enter tobacco. Sir Walter, in all his doublet-clad elegance, stepped forth like a 16th century hipster. He presented a pipe and this mysterious crumpled brown leaf with the exaggerated humility of someone about to take far too much credit. "My sovereign," he said, roughly. We're translating from florid ye old English here. "Inhale this wonder from across the sea, and your lungs shall be lighter than a madrigal on a midsummer's breeze." And so the Queen considered it, which is to say, she watched her ladies-in-waiting try it first. A few polite coughs, a great deal of waving smoke away with elegantly embroidered handkerchiefs, and then her turn. Now, we don't know precisely what happened. Diaries from the Queen's court are frustratingly vague, perhaps purposefully so. Some claim she coughed up a pea from a dinner 4 years prior and declared herself cured. Others say she merely nodded imperially and took a second puff, confident she'd discovered the elixir of eternal breath. Regardless of the accuracy, the effect on the court was immediate and dramatic. Tobacco fever spread faster than plague rats on roller skates. Courtiers who had never before inhaled anything more offensive than a rosemary-scented breeze were suddenly puffing like cosy chimneys before Christmas. Men in powdered wigs and theatrical beards stood in salons discussing the philosophical merits of smoke rings. Gentlewomen in corseted gowns sipped tea with one hand and daintily held pipes in the other, convinced it cleared the complexion and improved singing voices. And of course, the medical profession, because no profession loves a bandwagon more than 16th century doctors with no microscopes, clamoured to include tobacco in all manner of cures. Got a toothache? Smoke tobacco. Suffering indigestion? Take a tobacco poultice. Swoon too often at balls? Clearly, your spleen needs more smoke. It was even believed, utterly and wholeheartedly, that tobacco could ward off the dreaded plague. Some apothecaries instructed citizens to keep packets of tobacco in their boots, under their hats, or tied to the ends of their walking sticks. It didn't work, but it did make everyone smell a bit like a baked forest floor, which probably helped with the other smells of Tudor England. By the time Queen Elizabeth passed on to that great smoky beyond, tobacco had so entrenched itself in everyday life that no respectable physician would be caught dead without a pinch in his pouch and a theory about its magical properties. So strange, so wonderfully odd, this idea that the simple act of breathing in spicy scented leaf smoke could mend bones, calm nerves, and chase away melancholy. Medicine, as we now know, was once very much like a bedtime story, gentle nonsense told to keep you quiet and sleepy. As the London fog rolls lazily through cobbled lanes and the ghostly fragrance of pipe smoke drifts past a candlelit study, we leave the Queen's Court in a haze of hopeful puffery. Next, we'll float across the Channel, where French doctors, with much flair and very little evidence, decided that what the mind feared, the lungs could fix, with just a bit more smoke. The smoke of the gods, in the soft orange glow of 16th century candlelight. Long before medical disclaimers and cigarette packaging warnings, tobacco was not just harmless, it was divine, or at least divine adjacent. European physicians, with their silk robes, ruffled collars, and egos as large as their powdered wigs, had fallen head over satin slippers in love with the mysterious New World leaf. To them, this wasn't just a plant, it was potential, a botanical panacea, nature's cure, all with a bit of personality and an unusually smoky aftertaste. At the time, the human body was believed to be ruled by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A cheery quartet, each with its own temperament, churning mysteriously beneath one's skin like a medieval jazz band. Illness, they claimed, came from imbalance. Eat too much pepper, black bile might throw a tantrum. Feeling blue, blame your phlegm. But then, tobacco, this exotic, fragrant, fiery leaf, appeared like a strange guest at the humour party. No one quite knew where it fit in, so naturally, doctors projected their wildest dreams onto it. It was hot and dry, they reasoned, the perfect opposite to those sticky, cold humours that cause things like melancholy, or being mildly grumpy for most of February. You see, heating the body's insides was a highly sought-after therapeutic thrill. And what better way to do it than with smoke? Not just any smoke, medicinal smoke. Doctors of the time cheerfully prescribed tobacco for everything from chronic headaches to toothaches to actual sadness. A bit of a cough, blow some smoke. Feeling anxious, smoke some more. Have the plague. Well, it's probably too late, but you may as well enjoy a puff. By the late 1500s, a peculiar invention was making rounds in apothecaries and private homes. The tobacco smoke enema. Yes, as odd as that sounds, history confirms it. Warm smoke carefully blown into the rectum for therapeutic purposes. A technique whose benefits were praised without ever really being proven. A theme that, as you'll discover, repeats itself. The English even had designated tobacco blowers stationed along the River Thames in case someone drowned and needed resuscitation. Forget CPR. Back then, they'd try a little post-drowning puff from behind, with great hopes and probably mixed results. To be fair, this was a time when bathing was suspicious, leeches were promising, and a good bleeding was often considered a great start to the day. Smoking, especially the kind that came with the word medicinal in front of it, seemed almost cozy by comparison. It didn't involve knives, there wasn't much blood, and it came with a satisfying billow of aromatic fog. Distinguished gentlemen of science, after a thoughtful sniff and a sophisticated cough, even started compiling very serious lists of tobacco's powers. One Spanish physician claimed it cured all diseases of the brain, which is both wildly ambitious and conveniently difficult to dispute. Others said it could remove fatigue, protect the soul from melancholy, and, with enough faith and enough puffs, encourage celestial thoughts. It's worth remembering, of course, that early tobacco enthusiasts didn't just inhale, they applied it. There were herbal poultices steeped in smoky water, chewables, spit-outs, ointments, and ash rubs. Someone probably tried it as a shampoo. And why not? If tobacco could cleanse the mind of sadness, surely it could handle a mild case of dandruff. But amid all the enthusiasm, there were whispers, quiet doubts that perhaps setting things on fire and breathing them in wasn't entirely in line with the natural harmony of lungs. A few cautious notes in the medical literature, almost apologetic in tone, cautiously suggested that maybe the leaf had its limitations. But those, dear listener, were easy to ignore when your neighborhood apothecary offered a tobacco cure for digestive woes, heartbreak, and idle gossip. As you lay back and let this smoky tale drift into the dim corners of your dreams, imagine the flickering candlelight on the wall of a 1590s physician's study. Shelves piled high with dried herbs, glass vials, and an ornate pipe resting on a Latin-inscribed desk. Outside, the wind tickles the window panes, and the city hums with a belief in magic disguised as medicine. And what happens next? Well, let's just say tobacco's reputation is about to go up in smoke, in more ways than one. Smoke signals and royal noses. The year is 1586. Picture a royal court filled with whispers, brocaded curtains, and powdered wigs still in the prequel stages. A gentle hush floats through the halls of England's Queen Elizabeth I, and into that tapestry of dignity and draughty windows enters Sir Walter Raleigh, explorer, silver-tongued flatterer, and, most pertinently, tobacco enthusiast. Sir Walter, with the gallant confidence of a man who thinks fire belongs in his mouth, brought with him from the New World a curious habit, rolling dried leaves, setting them ablaze, and then calmly inhaling. Yes, he introduced this practice to the English elite, who quickly found that puffing on rolled vegetation made one look mysterious, slightly devilish, and quite possibly immune to the common cold. To be fair, it also gave them something to do with their hands at banquets, besides endlessly rearranging grapes. Raleigh himself was said to have so thoroughly embraced smoking that he became a walking fog machine. According to legend, not necessarily confirmed by anything scholarly, one of his own house servants supposedly doused him with water the first time they caught him mid-puff, assuming he was on fire. Whether or not that tale is true, it captures the delicious absurdity of tobacco's newcomer status. Imagine breathing out smoke in an age that still feared eclipses could steal one's soul. It drew attention, and make no mistake, the English nobility adored attention, not to mention novelty. By the late 16th century, pipes had become the absolute height of smoky sophistication. People weren't just smoking, they were performing it. Elaborate gestures, expressive exhales, and rhapsodic theories on its health benefits filled sitting rooms. It was balletic. Aristocrats floated in swirling clouds like philosophical dragons, discussing politics they barely understood. Between puffs, they definitely did not. Doctors, or rather 16th century versions of doctors, quite fond of robes, less into sterilization, began offering their own opinions, and overwhelmingly, they were pro-tobacco. Many believed smoke had purifying qualities, ingesting it through the nose or mouth, positively medicinal. Moderation, never heard of it. One particularly enthusiastic advocate of the time, a physician named Tobias Venner, recommended smoking after meals to aid digestion, probably the historical equivalent of a peppermint chew, if the peppermint were made of embers and hubris. Others insisted tobacco was a divine herb, capable of curing headaches, stomach pain, and even the plague. The only real side effect, they claimed, was that it made one appear rather dashing. Queen Elizabeth herself didn't publicly embrace the tobacco habit the way some of her courtiers did, though her court crackled with the crinkling of leaves and ego. Some kinsfolk and foreign ambassadors found it endlessly intriguing. Imagine negotiating trade deals while your opponent slowly puffs on a leafy fire stick, looking both aloof and possibly flammable. That's soft diplomacy right there. As England blew smoke rings into the future, the habit began trickling down from the velvet-laced aristocracy to common folks. Sailors, labourers, and the more pipe-curious townsfolk began trying it out for themselves. Soon, entire shops were dedicated to tobacconalia, which is a term I just invented, but feels oddly accurate. Merchants sold ornate pipes, tobacco leaf sachets, and even snuff boxes, dainty metal cases that held powdered tobacco for people to, quite inexplicably, snort. Ah, yes, tobacco up the nose. That's another rabbit hole of history we'll explore shortly. For now, know this. If you were alive and socially ambitious in Elizabethan England, smoking wasn't just a curious habit, it was practically a lifestyle. Between the lace cuffs and the codpieces, the addition of aromatic exhalation made you look cosmopolitan, learned, and maybe just a tad shamanic. And while modern science would eventually arrive with a stern wag of the finger and a thick book of warnings, back then clouds of aromatic smoke meant enlightenment, not lung damage. You weren't just inhaling leaves, you were flirting with divinity. As the embers of this chapter glow their sleepy orange, let us gently wander across the channel to a land where powdered wigs reigned supreme. Noses were poised for powdered delight, and the French invented an entirely new way to enjoy tobacco, one sharp sniff at a time. The royal snuff box and the sneezing aristocracy. Somewhere in the wafting velvet shadows of 17th century Europe, amidst powdered wigs and gold-trimmed handkerchiefs, an unusual royal accessory reigned supreme: the snuff box. Now, to modern ears, snuff might sound like the name of a mischievous woodland creature in a children's book, perhaps one who wears tiny boots and steals biscuits. But back then, snuff was the powdered form of tobacco, elegantly sniffed through the nose with dramatic flair and, ideally, a faintly poetic sneeze. Snuff wasn't smoked. No, that was far too rustic for high society. One did not puff like a chimney in Versailles salons. One sniffed, discreetly, delectably, and with just enough genteel nasal drama to suggest worldliness and lung health. After all, this was no vulgar vice. This was medicine, a panacea, a powdered miracle. Add a sprig of rosemary and voila, your migraine, melancholy, and occasional lack of charisma might all dissolve at once. The French court, with its sequined slippers and baffling etiquette, embraced snuff like doves to a well-trained shoulder. King Louis XIV himself, known for taking monarchic micromanagement to new heights, had several snuff boxes for different moods. One made of tortoiseshell for diplomacy, one of gold and emeralds for religious holidays, and perhaps another purely for looking at while sighing beautifully. This was not limited to France, of course. Across the continent, emperors, generals, lady poets, and average accountants all took to snuffing with the zeal of someone who had just been told their reeds and powders could quite literally restore balance to the humours, those elusive liquid forces that doctors were still semi-convinced controlled everything from digestion to one's taste in curtains. Snuff use was not just medicinal or stylish, it was political. Consider Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and part-time herbal hype woman. She promoted snuff as a cure for her migraines, which made it instantly fashionable and inevitably suspect. Physicians began recommending tobacco powder for every conceivable ailment: headaches, stomach upset, the sniffles, existential dread brought on by Gregorian chant. If someone fainted at court, the remedy was clear: waft a handful of finely milled tobacco under their nose and hope for the best. But not everyone was smitten with powdered leaves in fancy boxes. Some critics of snuff saw it for what it often was: glorified sneezing powder. English writer Thomas Dekker famously called snuff sniffers tobacco slaves, which is exactly the kind of insult you'd expect from a man who lived on gruel and moral superiority. Yet even the naysayers couldn't stop the rise of the snuff culture. Elegant rituals grew around it. Snuff boxes were passed along during conversations like tiny golden peace treaties. A gentleman was judged by the speed of his flick, the refinement of his sneeze, and the quality of his blend. Just as sommeliers whisper about tannins and mouthfeel today, 17th century snuff connoisseurs would murmur about the rustic notes of Virginia leaves versus the spicy warmth of Cuban varieties. Each snuff box was a mini museum. Artists crafted exquisite lids with mother-of-pearl miniature portraits, or tiny, slightly unnecessary cherubs, those eternal mascots of Baroque nonsense. Some boxes even had secret compartments, not for hidden messages, but for storing multiple blends. Tobacco logic insisted your nasal passages demanded variety. Of course, using snuff wasn't entirely without its quirks. A grand ball might be interrupted by a synchronized symphony of sneezes. In a single evening, nobles could go through more pocket squares than meaningful conversations. Still, no one seemed deterred. In fact, a well-timed sneeze was said to release melancholic vapors lodged in one's brain, or sinus. The science was, as usual, more enthusiastic than accurate. Meanwhile, across the channel in Britain, fashionable young gents known as macaronis, those of exaggerated dress and hair suggestive of tragic, windswept sea captains, would compete in snuff-based one-upmanship. One legend, possibly exaggerated by a sleepy historian with a flair for the dramatic, tells of a macaroni who commissioned a snuff box encrusted with actual meteorite fragments so that every sniff was cosmically significant. The peak of Europe's powdered tobacco romance would, eventually, taper off, no thanks to relentless sneezing and the increasing realization that stuffing one's nose with crushed leaves might not, in fact, be a substitute for good circulation or a decent night's sleep. But that moment of reckoning hadn't arrived yet. For now, spangled courtiers still thought of themselves as health enthusiasts and connoisseurs of nasal wellness, treating their temples with nothing less than 18-carat sniffables. As the candles flicker gently in an echoing hall of mirrors and powdered noses twitch with powdered dreams, we slip quietly away toward another mystery of the Shah miracle leaf. Next, we'll follow tobacco's smoky trail beyond the salons, where it meets an unlikely new friend, the plague doctor, the tobacco-smoking robots of the Enlightenment. There's something unusually endearing about Enlightenment thinkers when they tried to combine deep philosophy with gadgets that puff smoke. Picture a candlelit salon in 18th century Paris, filled with powdered wigs, harpsichords softly plinking in the background, and a well-dressed wooden automaton seated at the table, elegantly smoking a miniature pipe. Yes, tonight we petal drift gently into the beautifully bizarre world of tobacco-smoking machines, history's least expected party guests. Now, the age of enlightenment was about reason, logic, and discovering the secrets of the universe, preferably without spilling one's sherry. But tucked into the folds of all that enlightened thinking was a growing obsession with automata. Mechanical marvels that could play the flute, write poems, or, more intriguingly, exhale little rings of fragrant tobacco smoke like a polite dragon at a literary salon. Enter Vaucanson, the mechanical wizard of the 1700s. His name might sound like a brand of cheese, but Jacques de Vaucanson was actually a genius inventor who built machines so lifelike they made people question the boundaries between man and machine. And manners. His most famous invention, a shiny brass duck that ate grain, digested it using miniature bellows and tubes, and then, let's just say it finished the process accurately. It was an Enlightenment party trick that delighted and disconcerted in equal measure. But while the digestive duck stole the headlines, one of Vaucanson's lesser-known creations was an automaton that smoked a pipe, a lifelike model of a man who lit his own tobacco, inhaled it, and exhaled with a contemplative, puffy sigh. Sit with that image for a moment. An 18th century robot, lounging eternally, contemplating the faux philosophy of its own existence with clouds of artificially conjured smoke curling toward the ceiling. The tobacco automaton wasn't just whimsical tinkering. At the time, smoking was considered excellent for the lungs, particularly if you were a wooden mannequin with no lungs at all. Medicine and mechanics had not yet divorced, and inventors imagined such automata could be used in studies to better understand the mechanics of breathing itself. Because obviously, nothing yells medical breakthrough louder than teaching a robot to smoke. The Enlightenment was by no means alone in its fondness for artificial smokers. By the 19th century, clockmakers and tinkerers from Germany to Geneva were crafting their own mini pipe-puffing figurines. Some were dressed as Ottoman sultans, others as dapper Parisian gentlemen, and nearly all wore expressions of slightly smug contentment, the universal sign of someone whose only job is to breathe in, exhale, and never pay rent. These puffing contraptions had everything: spring-driven lungs, hidden bellows, tiny embers glowing thanks to cleverly placed coals or ember-colored glass. They delighted guests at dinner parties and baffled children into either lifelong fascination or sudden nightmares. Your move, modern science. But beneath the polished surface of these eccentric inventions lay a curious cultural truth. Smoking wasn't just a health practice or a pastime. It was thinky. It suggested reflective intelligence, philosophical depth, and vaguely artistic leanings. If a robot could smoke, was it pondering existence or just mimicking aristocratic rebellion? Either way, it was fashionable, and in a century before television, people would watch an automaton exhaling for hours, possibly while sipping cherry cordial and arguing about Rousseau. There is, of course, a poignant softness in all of it. These machines, created with such care and artistry, resting on parlour tables with their intricate gears and tin can chests, performing that most human of idle luxuries, taking a pause, lighting up synthetic tobacco leaves, and exhaling into nothing at all. Soothing, in a way, mysterious. A showcase of how humans linked elegance and intellect to the gentle drift of smoke through the air. If Descartes had seen them, he might have adjusted his famous phrase to, "I smoke, therefore I cogitate." But even these puffy marvels couldn't prevent the tide of skepticism that would eventually turn the smell of tobacco from a sign of sophistication into a suspicious little cloud. Yet for a time, these clockwork smokers were the toast of the salons, foggy breathers of elite conversation, eternal in thought and joyfully inefficient. And so, on we drift through the satin-gloved centuries toward a different tobacco tale. One where healing smog meets battlefield surgery, and where things get a bit more, shall we say, smoky and surgical. Smoke and superstition, the sacred pipes of early healers. Long before tobacco became the tightly rolled companion to anxious poets and baffled movie detectives, it held court in a much more mystical role, among the sacred whispers of healers, shamans, and the occasional very confident plant enthusiast, in the dense, sleepy mists of the Americas. Before any European boots waded in with buckles and bad intentions, tobacco was not a vice, it was a vessel. Among many indigenous peoples, tobacco was the breath of communication, a curling trail of smoke that carried prayers skyward to whichever divine ears might be tuning in that day. Picture this: a forest clearing, its borders stitched together by tall grasses and fragrant pine. Smoke drifts lazily upward from a ceremonial pipe carved with symbols older than most family trees. Around the fire, a circle of elders and young ones gather, not for recreation, but for reverence. The pipe is passed slowly, clockwise, never rushed, like storytelling told under the stars. Each puff a petition, each exhale a gentle wish. Tobacco was used not just to talk to the gods, but to diagnose ailments, soothe disagreements, and, on occasion, ward off particularly rude ghosts. And if you're wondering which variety they puffed on, it wasn't the milder cousin we know today. Oh no, the stuff they used was the strutting, swaggering older sibling of modern tobacco. Nicotiana rustica. Bold, brash, and packing enough nicotine to make a cardinal see sideways. A single puff could put some on the spiritual express rail to visionary dreams, or at least a bit of light-headed insight. In some tribes, tobacco was used in sweat lodge ceremonies, where steam mingled with sacred smoke, and the world of spirit and body felt deliciously blurred. In others, it was a healer's helper, blown gently over a wound or whispered into water to make a potion just a pinch more persuasive. And lest we assume this was mere folklore, note that these practices weren't without their logic. Tobacco has certain antimicrobial properties, and though modern doctors don't exactly write prescriptions for one spiritual puff daily, it's worth remembering that traditional medicine worked with what the earth offered, and sometimes it offered a plant that got you slightly transcendent. When tobacco was first witnessed by European explorers, their reactions were, well, let's call them panickedly curious. Reports poured back to various courts and cities across Europe, describing native people inhaling smoke through bundles of leaves, rolled papers, and long pipes. Some chroniclers were certain it was magic. Others called it witchcraft. A few assumed it was just an elaborate way to clear congestion. But what really caught their attention was this. Many of the healers using tobacco seemed unusually calm, collected, and, despite the pungent clouds, quite compelling. Enter the early adoption frenzy. European explorers eager to collect samples, test them on their own sniffly monarchs, and ideally, corner the market on this miracle inhalable. It wasn't long before apothecaries in Europe took a cue from their indigenous tutors and began packaging tobacco as medicine. Not the joyously spiritual sort, but rather the clinically questionable kind. But let's not race ahead. Back in the Americas, the true magic of tobacco wasn't the smoke. It was the ritual, the quiet way it bound a community, the hush around a pipe, the hush inside a prayer. In that silence, under the wide breathing sky, tobacco wasn't an escape. It was an entrance. Even the word itself is a light trail of history in vapor form. Some scholars suggest tobacco came from tabaco, a word in Arawakan languages that may have referred not to the plant, but to the Y-shaped pipe used to smoke it. So the name of the leaf might actually be the name of the tool. Imagine a world where coffee is called mug and tea is teapot. Language is a sleepy trickster, sneaking meaning into shapes and syllables. And, as with all spiritual traditions, the matches of understanding didn't always ignite cleanly. Europeans borrowed what they could, translated terribly, and then swaggered off to try monetizing it before anyone could stop them. But for a while longer, in the quiet corners of forests and plains, tobacco remained what it had always been: sacred, smoky, and just strange enough to feel like it knew a secret about the stars. Soon, that smoke would mingle with another breeze, the gusty winds of Renaissance curiosity and medical ambition. And as we drift there next, we'll meet a man so enthusiastic about tobacco, he prescribed it for everything, even headaches caused by too much tobacco. The gentleman's pipe and the woman's purse. Among the plush rugs, velvet drapes, and the faint rustle of crinoline skirts in 18th century drawing rooms, there was a presence that clung not only to the air, but to the very fabric of society: tobacco. It had sauntered into polite company like a charming rogue at a masquerade ball, smelling faintly of burnt wood and unexplained confidence. By this time, the miracle leaf had been puffed, snorted, chewed, and, believe it or not, inserted. But in this chapter of human affection for the curious plant, it became a social accessory, a signifier, a mood. Men had pipes. Women had purses discreetly hiding little snuff boxes filigreed with silver cherubs, or perhaps a tiny portrait of an admiring lapdog, depending on fashion and fondness. The gentleman's pipe had evolved into a peculiar kind of personality test. Long and claysome, you were probably a wistful poet who coughed theatrically into a lace-trimmed kerchief. Short and wooden. Likely a tradesman with a practical mind and strong opinions about chimney soot. And don't get started on those curiously curled meerschaum pipes. Dramatic flourishes of mineral carved into ducks, dragons, or disturbing bearded gentlemen, all gently exhaling philosophical smoke. But it wasn't just what you smoked, it was how and when. After dinner, the parlour would separate. Ladies upstairs with cordial and gossip, and men in the smoky sanctuary below, swapping grand opinions on parliamentary dysfunction, while embedding the sweet, earthy scent of tobacco into the upholstery forever. An aristocrat might boast about his newly imported Virginian leaves as if he'd grown them in the back garden himself, carefully fertilized with bits of Voltaire's wisdom and watered with Madeira. Women, however, had their own avenues into the tobacco renaissance, some paved with elegance, others with absolute audacity. Snuff, that finely ground tobacco powder, was the proper weapon of choice for ladies, a delicacy of scent and sophistication, often tucked into ornate compacts. A quick sniff at the ball could revive a fainting spirit, provoke a sneeze of embarrassment, or even become a flirtatious ritual. A dainty dabbing of the nostril, a coy look over a lavender-scented handkerchief. Quite the performance, especially if your potential suitor had a strong jawline and enough property to be worth the nasal itch. One Madame de Bloom fandangled herself into minor Parisian fame solely on her customized snuff collection, each blend designed, rather questionably, to evoke an emotion. Popular favorites included Melancholy of the Sea, which smelled mostly like damp sails, Whispers of Cherry Orchard, actual cherry not included, and the enigmatic sultry Elbow, whose ingredients have thankfully been lost to antiquity. Across the English Channel, London's apothecaries were making a small fortune recommending snuff, not just for liveliness and fashion, but supposedly against ailments ranging from naval despair to melancholic eyebrows. The science was unclear, the side effects consistent: allergic sneezing, public confusion, and the occasional powdered upper lip that, under candlelight, resembled a misplaced moustache. Tobacco had also drifted into poetry. There were odes, sonnets, love letters written to pipes with more devotion than to spouses. One poetic soul, Sir Neville Cumber Hash, once wrote, "O pipe, O smouldered muse, thy plume my comfort, when Countess Glareth and soup turns cold." Sir Neville's romantic life was bleak, but his pipe collection was vast and emotionally complex. As the century turned and powdered wigs began to retire into the curious annals of human hair decisions, questions started to whisper through the parlours and salons. Was all this sniffing and puffing truly wise? Could a miracle leaf be too miraculous? But hush now. Let the pipe rest in its stand, the snuff box closed gently shut. The fire is still warm, the room tinted with fragrant ghosts of dinner debates and powdered dreams. The night wears on, and when we open our eyes next, we may find ourselves sailing westward again, toward smokehouses, surveyors, and a founding father who kept surprising opinions tucked between cigars. Let's drift there. Softly, the smoke-filled apothecaries of Europe. Picture, if you will, a dimly lit apothecary in 17th century Paris, where dried roots hang beside powdered beetles and jars of every imaginable consistency line crooked wooden shelves. These places, oozing mystery and a faint scent of decay, were the beating heart of pre-Enlightenment medicine. And somewhere between the licorice root and the leech tank stood a rather dapper little jar, labelled simply Tabacum. You might assume quite reasonably that tobacco's path from sacred New World herb to European miracle drug was guided by science, sanity, and sober second thought. But that would misunderstand the spirit of the age entirely. You see, medicine in early modern Europe was a creative blend of Galenic tradition, trial and error intuition, and pure guesswork peppered with confidence. It was the golden era of, let's try blowing smoke where it doesn't belong. Literally. Sometime in the late 16th century, European physicians, positively enamored with the exotic new leaf from the Americas, decided that tobacco might be more than a curious stimulant. Good for headaches, fevers, digestion, melancholy, baldness, and certain unnamed women's afflictions. It was promptly declared a panacea, and no respectable alchemist or physician wanted to be left behind in the great tobacco gold rush of healing. One of the more notorious inventions to emerge from this period was the tobacco smoke enema. Yes, You heard that correctly, listener. In their desperation to wake up the near-drowned or the inconveniently unconscious, physicians funneled tobacco smoke directly into the patient's rear. The logic, if one can call it that, was that the warmth and stimulative properties of the smoke would revive them, a bit like giving your nervous system a fiery nudge from below stairs. In riverside hospitals along the Thames, entire resuscitation kits included bellows, pipes, and pre-packaged tobacco, all ready to breathe life into the half-departed. You might say they were ahead of their time, though not necessarily in the right direction. Meanwhile, in the calmer chambers of learned men, tobacco was being ingested, smoked, snuffed, and brewed into potions. A cup of hot tobacco tea was prescribed for lethargy, indigestion, or when your bodily humours had the gall to misalign themselves, which they did frequently, often based on the weather. Snuff, fine powdered tobacco, often flavoured with lavender or cinnamon, was heralded as a miracle for clearing the head, especially when administered in heroic quantities. One sniff, and you were sneezing yourself into, presumably, better constitution. It wasn't just common folk who took comfort in these rituals. Monarchs sniffled and puffed alongside their subjects. Queen Elizabeth Irvine herself is thought to have tried tobacco, though whether she found it medicinal or merely fashionable remains uncertain. James I, however, was less forgiving, famously describing tobacco as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. Naturally, nobody listened. Medical texts of the period offered helpful diagrams of tobacco's purported benefits. One enthusiastic physician claimed it could dry the brain, which, given the wig size of the time, was possibly a desirable effect. A dry brain, it seems, was less emotional, more balanced, and less likely to respond poorly to court intrigue or overcooked mutton. Apothecaries, always eager to profit from a leaf so capable, concocted extraordinary recipes. Tobacco oil, to rub on the chest for respiratory revival. Tobacco lozenges, to suckle in the presence of malodorous company. Even early versions of the nicotine patch appeared in the form of poultices rubbed into the skin, though one suspects they were less about steady absorption and more about giving you a rash to distract from whatever was originally wrong. By the early 1600s, tobacco had become a daily habit, no longer just a medicine, but a comforting ritual. It was something to do while waiting for gout to take your other foot, or while discussing the relative merits of different leech sizes. Physicians carried tiny silver snuff boxes, elevating their practice with a cloud of sanctified scent. Apothecaries used it to flavour tonics whose primary ingredient was despair, and scholars called its inhalation meditative. Of course, the miracle wouldn't last. Across the pages of history, enthusiasm tends to age poorly in the face of consequences. But for now, let us rest within this moment, in a tobacco-perfumed twilight, where the world believed healing came in leafy spirals, and smoke was a symbol of hope, not hazard. The apothecary's flame flickers low, his mortar and pestle silent, and the street outside shuffles with the snuffly footfalls of powdered wigs and high hopes. And while some tinkered with tinctures, others began to wonder, could entire nations be moved by a plant? Let's drift toward that. Scented smoke and velvet gloves. Long before tanned cowboys leaned on fences puffing contemplatively into the sunset, tobacco was not a badge of rebellion, nor the cause of those stern warning labels on the sides of boxes. It was wonderment wrapped in a leaf, believed to soothe your lungs, balance your humours, and, in France at least, save the Queen from an especially bad migraine. Naturally, Let me take you now, softly and slowly, to the silk-draped halls of European aristocracy in the late 1500s. The air is perfumed with orange blossom and anxiety. Diplomats tighten ruffled collars. Herbalists whisper urgently in Latin. And in the center of this fragrant storm sits Jean Nicot, the French ambassador to Portugal, and soon to become history's most accidentally influential pharmacist. Our dear Jean was not, as mispronounced legend might suggest, named for nicotine. No, the timeline flows the other way. Nicotine is named after Nicot, for this is a bedtime story where backwards names make perfect sense. Jean wasn't a doctor, though he did read the occasional medical text while lounging in embroidered breeches. He had recently come upon the New World's holy herb, as it was described in Portuguese courts, tobacco. A fascinating plant that they did not yet light on fire and inhale with gusto, but rather crushed, pressed into oils, or powdered and, well, gently inserted into various orifices. Most charmingly of all, into the nose, via what polite society now calls snuff. Queen Catherine de' Medici, ruler of French fashion and occasional realms, was said to suffer from migraines so ghastly they could frighten the moon from its orbit. Bandaged in silk and submerged in lavender, she grew weary of the usual remedies, unicorn horn dust, repeated incantations, or the ever-dependable method of letting out just enough blood to mildly regret it. Enter Jean Nicot, armed with powdered tobacco, the hopeful glint of an amateur herbalist, and probably a velvet glove full of enthusiasm. He prepared a delicate snuff and presented it to the Queen, kneeling as though offering the Holy Grail. She sniffed, she blinked, she sighed in regal relief. Whether her headache truly vanished or she merely wanted Jean to stop hovering is between her and history. Word spread like warmed butter. Tobacco, scribes proclaimed, soothes the head, strengthens the brain, revives the spirits. Physicians held it in cautious awe. Apothecaries began slipping it into creams, poultices, and cordial tonics. Some claimed it improved memory. Others swore it cured toothaches, indigestion, and the heartbreak of psoriasis. And still others, possibly the early PR team, announced that it could ward off plague. It wasn't uncommon to see nobles walking through gardens, holding ornamental noses high, dabbing snuff delicately while discussing treaties and alchemy. In Spain, the Habsburgs treated it with reverence. In England, gentlemen passed around pipes with such glee you'd think they were sharing birthday cake. Of course, no historical marvel is complete without the addition of highly conflicted clergy. While some priests praised it as God's leafy balm, others were grimly certain it was, as one put it, the devil's smoke rising from hell's chimneys. Clearly, Thursday sermon prep was running long. By the early 1600s, tobacco had risen from exotic plant to pan-European panacea. Markets bustled with blends and tins and mystery mixtures. Venice had shops that promised custom snuff recipes tailored to your astrological temperament. For melancholic Capricorns with a stiff ankle, perhaps, a quaint little lie in a brass box. Tobacco even began to appear in the medical textbooks of the day. Tudor physicians with ruffs the size of dinner tables wrote stern but semi-poetic notes. Tabacum, noble leaf, excellent for purifying the air and restoring the breath of life. And they meant it. In profoundly damp England, where fresh air was a myth told to children, stuffing tobacco in your nostrils was considered an act of self-care. As for our friend Jean Nicot, he retired in quiet satisfaction. He never knew he'd become the namesake of a substance that schoolchildren centuries later would learn about during lectures on respiratory disease prevention. He simply returned to his estate, surrounded by orchids, letters from grateful secretaries of state, and perhaps the lingering scent of snuff on lace cuffs. The world, unbeknownst to itself, was shifting. The once rare leaf was becoming common. It spread across borders, leapt nest-like into pipes, teacups, scientific journals, and eventually, profit margins. But for now, it was still medicine, still magic, still whispered about in courtyards beneath moonlight, with the hush of awe and the rustle of silk slippers. Speaking of whispers and moonlight, we shall now follow the curling trail of smoke to the next curious tale, where the priest takes sides and disapproval reaches deliciously theatrical levels. Smoke signals and royal sinuses. As twilight gently tucked itself into the folds of 17th century England, a curious ritual would have been wafting through palace corridors, not involving swords or scandal, but something more aromatic. Dried tobacco leaves being set aflame, stuffed into ornately carved pipes, and inhaled with the poise of a courtly deer sampling the forest mist. You see, by this time, Europeans had gone far beyond merely gawking at tobacco as a New World oddity. They had started treating it like divine intervention in vegetal form. And not just common folk. No. Even royalty began cradling pipes like cherished goblets and puffing away with the solemnity of poets trying to remember a dream. Let's waft gently through some musky pages of Old English quirks, shall we? Enter King James the Faz. Yes, the same man behind the Bible translation, and possibly the last person you'd pair with a cozy fireside tobacco session. In fact, if tobacco and King James had a Facebook status, it would have read, "It's complicated." In 1604, James wrote a delightful little essay titled "A Counterblast to Tobacco," which sounds like an odd Elizabethan chess move, but was actually a scathing anti-smoking manifesto, where he poetically described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. Quite the mood killer at royal dinner parties. And yet, here's the smoky paradox. While James I detested tobacco with the ferocity of a man continuously haunted by pipe smoke drifting into his beef stew, many in his court, even his physicians, continued to champion it. How? Well, tobacco had made its way into the medicinal playbook. Inhaling its smoke, they believed, could purge ill vapors, stimulate the humors, and ward off infections. In a world missing antibiotics and, frankly, a coherent understanding of internal organs, burning a bit of leaf and breathing deeply seemed as reasonable as anything. But the age's medical creativity didn't stop there. One of tobacco's most eyebrow-raising applications was the tobacco enema. Yes, you heard right. The 1600s were a time when doctors had reached deep into the annals of desperation and produced, emphatically, a kit designed to blow smoke right up someone's derriere. The theory? That the warming, invigorating power of tobacco smoke could resuscitate the unconscious, revive the drowned, or at the very least, provide a brisk surprise to the posterior. These kits were placed quite earnestly along the banks of the Thames River, much like modern defibrillators, ready to be used by passers-by in emergencies. One can only imagine the startled shouts of, "Quick, he's not breathing, fetch the bellows." Thankfully, this peculiar passion faded away in time, though the idiom to blow smoke up someone's endured in a more metaphorical sense. Medical manuals of the day were awash in powdered contradictions. One might find tobacco recommended for phlegm and for dryness, for fatigue and sleeplessness, for melancholy, of course, although anything that had people lying down with cucumber slices on their forehead was reputed to cure melancholy in those days. By the mid-1600s, wealthy households of England were outfitted with smoking rooms meant not just for indolent puffery, but also for fragile health. These rooms resembled tiny monasteries of aromatic vapor, lined with brass spittoons, curious herbal tools, and the occasional philosophical text that no one could quite explain. Such was tobacco's status, a sacred-smelling panacea wrapped in superstition and ritual. Even the Great Plague of London in 1665 couldn't shake people's faith. On the contrary, it strengthened it. Taverns offered free tobacco for customers who lingered too close to infected neighborhoods. Some schoolmasters forced children to smoke pipes before class, believing it would protect them from infection. Little hands coughed bravely against giant curling puffs. Imagine the school report card. Timothy excels in Latin, struggles in arithmetic, and has developed a charming Churchillian squint. And if anyone dared raise an eyebrow, physicians were quick to cite ancient authorities, especially the mythical appeal that it had been discovered by wise savages who clearly knew a thing or two about jungle medicine. European doctors, thank you very much, were simply carrying the torch of leafy wisdom forward, sometimes straight into a person's left nostril. So here lay the dream of early modern Europe, a realm where thick, fragrant clouds doubled as medicine, lavender lace smoke halos that floated over the heads of royalty, physicians and schoolboys alike. And all the while, tiny clouds of doubt might have hovered, just faint enough to ignore for a few more centuries. Let your thoughts drift like curling tendrils of pipe smoke, rising up through the candlelit halls of mad medicine and monarchy. And as we lean deeper into the mystery, someone quite peculiar waits on the faraway island of Java, puffing, pondering, and ready to spin an even stranger tale. A royal cough and the pipe of providence. Imagine, if you will, the faint rustle of velvet robes, the flicker of candlelight on ornate wood paneling, and somewhere, hidden beneath layers of powdered wigs and etiquette, the unmistakable sound of a royal cough, deep, persistent, slightly melodic, a cough that echoed through the hallways of history, not because it was particularly dramatic, but because it belonged to someone with a crown. Tonight, we tiptoe into the courtly corridors of 17th century England, where tobacco didn't just make you look dashing while brooding by the fire. It was hailed as a royal remedy, worthy of kings, commoners, and quite a few confused apothecaries. At the centre of this tobacco-scented tale sits King James I of England. Now, James was not a man known for subtlety. He once described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. So yes, not exactly a brand ambassador for the tobacco industry, and yet, despite this poetic condemnation, he wrote it in his delightfully grumpy 1604 pamphlet, A Counterblast to Tobacco. Tobacco still found its way into the royal medicine chest. You see, the contradiction was part of the charm of the age. The medicinal use of tobacco had already wafted its way across Europe, scented with stories of miraculous cures. English physicians, trying to keep up with those trendy French doctors and their dramatic mustaches, prescribed tobacco for everything from toothaches to plague prevention. It was medicine that conveniently came with a pipe, and in royal courts, drama and medicine always enjoyed a peculiar waltz. One royal physician, Sir William Paddy, a man whose name alone inspires immediate trust or immediate hunger, recommended tobacco as part of a complex therapeutic routine that involved dietary regulation, bloodletting, and occasional pleasant-smelling smoke blown into various unsuspecting body parts. This may be an important moment to gently remind you, dear dreamer, that in the early 1600s, medical science still leaned heavily on whatever sounded vaguely impressive and came from overseas. Spitting into a bowl while humming a Flemish hymn had just as much medical weight as a prescription. Now, back to our wheezing aristocrats. It was said that the noble cough of the House of Stuart was often calmed by a gentle pipe of Virginia tobacco. The leaves had arrived bundled in crates carried across the Atlantic, picked and packed by labourers in the damp fields of the colony. Once in London, the leaves were dried, crushed, and passed through the hands of curious physicians, luxury merchants, and the occasional mysterious herbalist named Old Marjorie. Even the Queen's own handmaidens were known to carry little silver tins of powdered tobacco, snuff, pressed delicately into lace kerchiefs, taken with the same poise one might reserve for a whispered foreign insult. There were serious debates at court. Could a good, strong puff cure melancholy? Was smoking after supper good for digestion, or simply excellent for gossip? Was that new bishop coughing because he needed tobacco, or because he'd had a suspicious run-in with an ill-tempered swan near the moat? Historians may never know, but we do know that despite King James's vocal hatred of tobacco, his government taxed it enthusiastically, and physicians kept on prescribing it with unnerving optimism. Perhaps the most charmingly odd tale is that of Prince Henry, James's eldest son, and sometimes enthusiastic user of powdered tobacco for his frequent headaches. It was said that he found snuff extremely helpful, or at least extremely noble looking. After all, nothing says future king quite like sneezing majestically in a satin doublet. As the 1600s puffed along, tobacco became more than a treatment. It became ritual. Morning pipes for the melancholy, medicinal cigars for those with sore joints, and late-night tobacco enemas for, well, we'll let your dreams take that absurdity the rest of the way. So there, in the chambers of kings and the cabinets of physicians, tobacco settled comfortably into the folds of high society like a well-heeled house guest, odd, over-perfumed, and entirely convinced of its curative powers. As the candles in the royal bedchambers flicker lower and the portraits on the walls seem to give a knowing wink, we'll quietly close the velvet-carpeted door on the royal tobacco trials of Jacobean England. And next, we'll take a gentle turn down a much smokier path, where sailors and scallywags carried tobacco not for sore throats, but for pay, power, and a peculiar sense of fashion. The smoking school of medicine. Floating gently through the curls of old smoke trails and half-remembered medical theories, we arrive somewhere rather curious in history. Picture early 17th century Europe, a place where superstition and science held hands like two squabbling siblings, and tobacco, yes, tobacco, had climbed the academic ranks to earn itself a mortarboard and gown. That's right, it became a subject of study, a serious one. Let's take a sleep stroll down the ivy-covered hallways of what could loosely be called the smoking school of medicine. Officially, the universities didn't exactly issue degrees in pathology, but several ambitious men of medicine did believe that lighting up a pipe was just as critical to your health as wearing socks in winter or avoiding angry livestock. Enter Tobias Venner, a physician from Bath, England, who around 1620 published a book with a deliciously yawn-inducing title, Via Recta ad vitam longam, which translates, rather hopefully, to The Right Way to a Long Life. It's the kind of book that wears spectacles and drinks warm nettle tea at bedtime. Venner preached moderation in all things, except, oddly, pipe smoke. He claimed that tobacco, when used judiciously, could stimulate the body, dry up superfluous phlegm, and prevent one from falling into divers diseases. Perhaps Tobias believed our bodies were just over-soaked sponges, and tobacco was the mystical ringer. But wait, while Venner was refining your vapor dosage, other physicians were far bolder in their smoky prescriptions. Some encouraged tobacco enemas. Yes, you heard right. In certain enthusiastic circles, there was a belief that the very best way to administer tobacco's supposed healing powers was to, well, introduce it from the other direction. Now don't panic. We're just talking sleep stories here. No equipment will be required under your blanket tonight. In London, and later in early American colonies, there existed literal resuscitation kits fitted along riverbanks that included bellows meant to blow tobacco smoke into the lungs or nether regions of drowning victims. These tobacco smoke enemas, blessed by medical approval at the time, were thought to stimulate breathing and warm the body. Nothing says welcome back to life like a smoky breeze in the least expected place. Back in France, meanwhile, little apothecaries were blending up tobacco extracts that, according to their labels, could soothe toothaches, cure worms, and reduce fits of melancholy. Of course, they failed to mention that tobacco might also invite a 6-hour coughing session, a short bout of inexplicable giggling, followed by a century-long regret paid forward through several generations. Doctors of the day were in deep debate. Was tobacco more heating than cooling, drying than moistening, a delight to melancholic temperaments, or a danger to sanguine ones? You see, medieval and early modern medicine was still enthralled to the ancient Greek system of 4 humours. A proper prescription often sounded more like weather forecasting than diagnosis. You have too much black bile, sir. What you need is a drying wind administered via smoke. And amid all of this, let us not forget the poor patients, those bountifully trusting souls who visited their apothecary, clutching their aching stomachs, only to be advised to puff on a pungent cigar, or perhaps swab their gums with a smoky tincture. One wag at the time reportedly said it worked wonders on his insomnia. Not because tobacco cured it, mind you, but because the flavour made him so lethargic with regret, he simply gave up and went back to bed. Ah, the dreamy optimism of it all. You can nearly hear the echo of pipe stems tapping across Europe, as hopeful men in stiff collars and longer beards than ideas inhaled their dose of destiny. Of course, as with many things once thought miraculous, leeches, powdered mummies, or trying to cure gout by sleeping with a live pigeon on your foot, tobacco's time at the pinnacle of medical respectability was bound to wobble. But not quite yet. Our dreamy wanderings have merely paused outside the hall of the learned and smoky physicians. Soon, we'll find ourselves drifting down dusty trade routes, where tobacco's journey becomes even stranger. Hitching rides with pirates, poets, and a few people who very much misunderstood how noses work. Let's float onward. Snuff boxes and silk waistcoats. There's a certain elegance to history's bad ideas when they come dressed in velvet. And nowhere is this truer than in the 18th century fashion accessory that was the snuff box, an object so refined, so dainty, and so completely dedicated to the art of sticking powdered tobacco directly up one's nose. Snuff, for the uninitiated or blissfully ignorant, was a finely ground tobacco that had been delicately infused with various scents, rose petals, cinnamon, violets, or, occasionally, whatever someone dropped on the factory floor. Its purpose, simple, to be snorted, preferably with all the grace of a minor nobleman fending off ennui. Now, imagine a drawing room in London in 1752. Men in powdered wigs and tight breeches gather to debate politics, sip claret, and perform synchronized nasal inhalations of tobacco dust. Each retrieves a snuff box, small, ornate, often more expensive than the contents, and with great ceremony, flips it open with a satisfying silver click. Some snuff boxes had hidden mirrors. Others played tiny tunes. The fanciest might give you a perfume puff, or, in one memorable case, a mini painting of a shepherdess doing unspeakably saucy things with a basket of pears. Snuff was believed not only to be fashionable, but medicinal. According to the pamphlet-loving physicians of the day, a good daily snort could cure migraines, colds, indigestion, and, somehow, shyness. Got the sniffles? Add more snuff. Feeling melancholic? Try lavender-infused powder. One particularly optimistic French doctor even claimed it sharpened the intellect, although studies have confirmed that genius tends not to issue exclusively from the nose. The royal courts of Europe were deeply committed to this nasal ritual. In Versailles, Louis XV reportedly had an entire apothecaries shelf of scented snuffs, each designed to match a different mood or political anxiety. One for diplomacy, one for war, one, some speculate, for visiting mistresses. His grandson, Louis XVI, had a snuff-box collection that could probably have bailed out the national debt had it not been relocated by torch-wielding revolutionaries. Even popes got involved. Not ones you'd expect to be huffing powdered leaves, surely. But yes, Pope Benedict XIII, as serene as his job implied, was known to favour a daily dose of snuff. So much so that he allowed it inside the sacred walls of the Vatican. A bold move. Nothing says spiritual enlightenment like a pontifical sneeze echoing through St. Peter's. The act of taking snuff was not without its etiquette. There existed entire manuals on the proper way to extract, sniff, and react. Gentlemen were advised never to grimace mid-snort, and under no circumstances to sneeze directly onto a periwigged companion. Anyone who dared to pinch, huff, and then shake their snuffy fingers without a kerchief was considered little more than a social anarchist. One's dignity was measured not in gold, but in how gracefully one could inhale. Women, too, participated, especially among the elite. It was said that Madame de Pompadour could flutter a fan, adjust her bodice, and take a snuff hit, all in one impossibly fluid motion. Romantic poets sometimes composed verses about their muse's tobacco-kissed breath. Less romantic ones complained of constant sneezing and borrowed handkerchiefs. But as the 19th century began to roll forward in its rickety, steam-powered optimism, the once mighty snuff box began to lose its cultural glow. A new invader had arrived, cigarettes, and they came with dashing imagery. Soldiers lighting up in trenches, lovers sharing a matchlight, artists brooding behind nicotine veils. Inhaling tobacco through one's face holes was still fashionable. It just shifted downward, from nose to lungs. Snuff boxes became relics, antique curios for display cabinets, symbols of a time when people truly believed that elegance and powdered tobacco should mingle freely in polite society. Some lingered, clutched by aging dukes with lingering nasal addictions, but most found their way into dusty auction lots beneath labels that read ornate boxes with mysterious brown residue. Still, in some quiet corners of Europe, one might stumble upon an old gentleman, perhaps seated at the edge of a crumbling stone fountain, who opens a beaten snuff box with reverence. He taps, pinches, inhales, and gazes wistfully into the middle distance, remembering a time when every great political argument came with a sneeze, and as the powdered echoes of an age drift gently into the silence, another tale of tobacco's curious odyssey waits just around the corner. Steam-powered pipes and the great tobacco spa. Just as the 18th century began to prance about in powdered wigs and silk stockings, the world was hit with a realization as bold as a Georgian chamber pot. If tobacco could cure headaches, protect against plague, and allegedly make your skin glow like moonlight bouncing off a polished onion, why not bathe in it? And oh yes, they tried. Tobacco spas were dreamed up in the minds of well-funded eccentrics and half-trained physicians who believed firmly and with monocle-clinking conviction that tobacco, when simmered long enough, could become a kind of smoky medicinal broth. Add a little steam, wrap it in mahogany paneling, and you had yourself the latest destination for aristocratic wellness. One particularly ambitious spa was built in the German state of Saxony, nestled between a bakery and a questionable taxidermy shop. This establishment, known simply as Haus des Nebels, or House of Fog, offered a selection of treatments entirely based on the miracle powers of Nicotiana tabacum. Patrons could soak their feet in warm, nicotine-infused basins, or indulge in the famous tobacco vapor chamber, which was essentially what happened when someone turned a gentleman's smoking room into a particularly humid sauna. The vapor chamber operated with a great deal of brass tubing and a stern-faced attendant named Hildegard, who insisted every steam session begin with a prayer and a brisk rub-down with a horsehair mitt. To open the pores, she'd say, though many believed she just liked exfoliating the nobility. By this point in time, medical theories were still swirling bewilderingly around the idea that the human body was a vessel of unruly humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, all of which needed constant balancing, preferably via leeches, kaleidoscopic enemas, or yes, steamy tobacco lounges. One Baron von Plufferich, a noted dandy and collector of commemorative cheese plates, swore by the House of Fog's therapeutic sessions. He claimed that after just 2 weeks of bi-daily tobacco condensate facials, his melancholy had lifted, his gout had retreated, and most impressively, his sideburns had begun to grow in curly and symmetrical. Of course, it's worth noting that most spa-goers tended to swoon dramatically halfway through their steam sessions. Some believe it was from the sheer relaxation and the stratified layers of enlightenment, but more likely it was due to prolonged nicotine exposure and a complete absence of fresh air. Dr. Julius Ritterschwein, a self-appointed expert in botanical therapies and an amateur beekeeper who'd also once been banned from the Viennese Opera House for consuming licorice too enthusiastically, published several papers proclaiming tobacco steam to be the airy elixir of betterment. He recommended its use for skin ailments, lung strength, general complaints, and, somewhat optimistically, for spiritual refinement. Now, back across the English Channel, London wasn't about to be shown up by continental innovation. The English had their own ideas, and if you gave them a little tobacco and a minor sense of rivalry in health treatments, they'd get to work quickly, possibly while riding a horse side saddle with a teacup glued to their palm. Enter the tobacco douche, a device patented in 1722 that, despite its name, was less of a scandal and more of a brass and leather contraption designed to deliver precisely tuned puffs of warm tobacco smoke directly into the most delicate areas of one's anatomy. Yes, inventors believed this kind of treatment could rescue people from drowning, shock, shyness, and the plague. One physician, Dr. Reginald Bumpworth, insisted that rectal fuming could reawaken the dying spirit at its very core. He operated out of a tiny surgery behind a fishmonger and claimed a 12% success rate, though most of his patients remained suspiciously quiet, forever. Still, across Europe and the American colonies, the idea that tobacco was healthiest when applied everywhere but actually smoked persisted with genuine enthusiasm. Spa treatments, like the steam bath and the oddly hissing basins of brown-stained water, were surprisingly popular, creating a whole generation who firmly believed that coughing after a hot soak meant you had expelled the bad airs. And maybe they weren't completely wrong. After all, a warm bath and a good story, however smoky, have cured more sleepless minds than we can count. And speaking of stories, as the tobacco plant kept unspooling its leafy charms across business, medicine, and society, it would soon be dragged into one of the silliest academic rivalries of the 18th century. So fluff your pillow, breathe in the imaginary scent of a wood-panelled spa, and prepare to meet a professor who tried to rewrite tobacco's history with nothing but chalk, ego, and an alarming number of wigs. The sacred smokers of the Sauna Society. In the misty corners of 17th century Scandinavia, where pine forests breathed secrets into the cold northern air, there existed a most peculiar ritual, the sacred sauna smoke. It sounds serene, doesn't it? Until you learn that tobacco was a key guest in the steam. You see, while other parts of Europe were tossing tobacco into pipes, poultices, and the occasional pudding, don't ask, our northern friends decided to invite it to the spa. The stories begin in the villages of Sweden and Finland, places wrapped in snowdrifts and birchwood silence, where the sauna was not just a place to sweat, but a sanctuary of warmth, wellness, and whispering ghosts of pagan wisdom. During these quiet, sacred steams, early believers of tobacco's medicinal might would bring with them little charms, bones of salt cod, copper trinkets, and most unusually, dried tobacco leaves. Now, these weren't just idle leaf holders. No. These were special types of folk, part healer, part chimney, who called themselves röktänkare, or smoke thinkers. They described themselves as vessels through which wisdom could pass, via tobacco-infused clouds, which just so happened to create a really great excuse to hotbox the sauna. Men and women, sometimes draped in wool towels that resembled medieval beachwear, would enter the sauna, ignite small braziers of smouldering leaves, breathe deeply, and hum low notes meant to anchor the soul. It's important to remember that at the time, nobody questioned whether inhaling a room filled with smoke in an enclosed wood-lined box might be anything other than pure spiritual housekeeping. From a modern perspective, it sounds not unlike trying to gain enlightenment in an enchanted barbecue. But for them, the logic was airtight, like the sauna walls. Tobacco, with its mysterious smoke and suspiciously energetic leaves, was a divine cleanser, capable of removing bad spirits, melancholy, stubborn warts, and the general malaise that came from living somewhere the sun set in October and reappeared sometime in April. Healthful or not, the experience was described in glowing terms by those who partook. One diary from a traveling bishop records, "I entered the chamber prepared to faint, yet found myself awakened by the holy fumes. The air was warm and alive with movement. My bones danced, or possibly trembled from early nicotine poisoning. It's hard to say." Outside the sauna too, the Finnish and Swedish doctors, or anyone with a decent mustache and access to a mortar and pestle, began prescribing tobacco-based elixirs for just about everything. Stuffed nose? Try tobacco snuff pressed into rose petal paste. Toothache? Rinse with tobacco leaf tea and bite a silver coin. Got an excess of black bile? A good smoke and a nap in a sauna ought to do it. And while the rest of Europe was still attempting to roast fevers out with garlic foot rubs and wine enemas, the Scandinavians had pioneered the world's coziest smokehouse medicine spa. It was also, in a twist of irony, one of the only places where you could get warm, healthy, and slightly addicted in the same afternoon. These sauna rituals didn't just attract locals either. Curious travelers from France and England took these stories home, although they typically pared them down to, "I saw a man bake himself in smoke and grin like a madman. Lovely chap." Eventually, more structured medicine poked its cautious head in to say, "Actually, perhaps filling one's lungs with vaporized leaf in an enclosed room isn't ideal." But these things take time, and tradition has a way of outlasting facts, especially when wrapped in steam and stories and the smell of pine wood and scorched socks. Today, of course, we have sleeker saunas, infrared, Bluetooth-enabled, and tragically tobacco-free. But sometimes, in the quiet hiss of the rocks and the soft creak of the wood walls, you can still imagine the old smoke thinkers humming gently, chasing away invisible spirits on aromatic clouds. And as the steam clears and our journey drifts past this unusually fragrant sanctuary, we turn next toward a city that once tried to ban smoking by punishing people with, well, increasingly peculiar methods. But we'll slip softly into that story right after this breath. Chimneys, snuff, and the Great British Panic. Imagine it's a foggy London twilight in the mid-1600s. Candles flicker in windows, a few scattered coach wheels creak down bricked alleys, and somewhere just off Fleet Street, a gentleman in a ruffled collar sneezes. Not from the usual London chill, but from something far more fashionable. Powdered tobacco. Yes, friend, this is the golden age of snuff. A time when powdered tobacco was sniffed instead of smoked, and when a good sneeze was a mark of high society. Don't worry, we're gliding gently through this page of history, cloaked in a blanket of sleepy smoke. Now, snuff didn't start in England. It drifted in like an expensive French perfume, on ships from the New World, trailing behind whispers of miraculous cures and tales of native peoples imbibing sacred powders through the nose. European nobles were completely delighted by this, especially because sniffing tobacco looked far more refined than puffing like a chimney in public, a habit now being frowned upon as terribly base. One scholar even claimed that sniffing tobacco was the perfect cure for a melancholic spleen, which sounds extremely made up, but was printed with complete confidence. So here comes England, a nation still recovering from civil war, getting used to its latest wobbly monarch, and trying desperately to be as fashionable as French courtiers. Imagine elegant salons where powdered wigs so tall they have anxiety of their own share whispers over porcelain snuff boxes. These were small, ornate containers, often made of mother of pearl or ivory, filled with finely ground tobacco. And the ritual, oh, exceedingly delicate. A person of distinction might raise the snuff box with slow drama, between thumb and forefinger of course, flick open the gold lid with a satisfying click, take a tiny pearl-handled spoon, and place just the gentlest pinch of snuff beside one nostril. A dainty inhale, sniffed, then a pause, brow slightly arched, followed by either a dignified sneeze or a modest sigh of appreciation. Commoners, meanwhile, saved up to afford simpler forms of snuff and tried to mimic the courtly ritual, though usually with more sneezing and fewer monogrammed spoons. And then, because it's England, paranoia got involved. Somewhere between the powdered wigs and powdered tobacco, rumours began to circulate that snuff might actually be dangerous. Cue the newspapers of the day, which could make even an especially large turnip sound like a political threat. One writer warned that sniffing tobacco might cause the collapse of the nasal passage, and another more dramatically predicted that it would burn the brain's inner spirals. That's not a medical term. That's a gothic horror novel. But wait, it gets better. Around this time, the government began to fret over people importing snuff without paying proper taxes. Smuggling loopholes sprang up, and snuff boxes shrank to suspiciously tiny sizes. Women famously concealed them in lockets, men in their tall boots. One man was caught hiding snuff in a hollowed-out book, which honestly seems too clever to punish. The British customs officers cracked down, not gently. Soon, every respectable merchant entering the kingdom found their luggage upended, all for the noble cause of stopping powdered leaf sneezing at the border. All of this happened while other parts of England were still half convinced tobacco could cure lethargy, sharpen memory, and bring on visionary dreams. Which, let's be fair, it probably did. If your vision involved disorienting dizziness and an intense need to sit down. One particularly theatrical pamphlet even insisted that snuff improved chess-playing abilities, a claim never quite replicated under scientific conditions, but charming nonetheless. The powdered leaf, it read, awakens thought in the nostrils and clarity in the mind. That's quite a power for something sold next to hair pomade. By the time Queen Anne sat upon the throne, a proper snuff aficionado herself, most of the upper class was very much hooked, not just to the tobacco, but to the ritual. Dropping snuff mid-conversation was considered ruder than skipping someone's birthday. A man once spilled a tin of snuff on his host's carpet and was asked never to return. The snuff was fine, the etiquette irreparably broken. And so England carried on, snuffing, sneezing, and speculating until, eventually, attention turned away from the nose and back, in time, to the lips. But for a peaceful little pocket of history, the genteel British sneeze reigned supreme. As the powdered air clears and our tale quiets down, we'll take a soft wander into an entirely different experiment. A glow-in-the-dark idea from 18th century physicians who thought burning tobacco might cure drowning. But that, dear dreamers, is an odd tale for a gentler slumber. The Turkish bathhouse and the smoky spa surprise try, if you will, to conjure up the image of a luxurious 17th century Turkish bathhouse. Steam curling around tiled mosaics, slippers slapping gently along marble floors, and somewhere in the damp mist, a very serious man is methodically puffing tobacco smoke into his own ear. Yes, dear listener, as unlikely as it sounds, the age of the Ottoman hammam wasn't just about exfoliation and diplomatic gossip. For a time, it also became entangled with one of the strangest chapters in the life of tobacco, as a spa treatment. To understand how we arrived at the smoky spa, we need to recall the peculiar medical mindset of the time. The body, you see, was thought to contain humours, not jokes sadly, but invisible liquids like black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Pure comedy in hindsight. The balance of these humours was believed to dictate your health, your mood, and perhaps even your ability to find matching socks. Enter tobacco, not as a vice, but as a botanical superhero. In several corners of the world, be it Europe or the Ottoman Empire, tobacco was viewed as a wonder herb capable of warming cold temperaments, expelling disobedient phlegm, and chasing out spirits, both metaphysical and gastrointestinal. The Turkish bath, already a canvas for exotic indulgence, began to incorporate tobacco into its rituals, not just for lounging with a pipe, but for active therapeutic use. Steam rooms thick with aromatic herbs became home to tobacco-infused vapors. Some patrons claimed that the smoke relaxed the body. Others believed it expelled bad humours through the skin, or more dramatically, through the ears and nostrils. In some bathhouses, practitioners use smoke-blowing techniques to cleanse areas of concern. Having a headache? One well-trained attendant might puff tobacco into your left ear. Trouble with the spleen? A quick waft of smoke to the belly would get things sorted, or at least very slightly warm. Now let's shift the lens to the tutuncu, the Ottoman tobacco seller. More than just a merchant, the tutuncu was often viewed as a sort of smoky apothecary. He might be summoned to prepare a bespoke tobacco concoction, perhaps mulberry dried leaves with cloves and cinnamon, to be used in a bathhouse session or applied, brace yourself, as a tobacco poultice for aching joints. Yes, the fabled tobacco patch existed long before nicotine patches, though in a more crumbly fashion and with considerably more coughing. It didn't stop with bathhouses. Across the empire, some women would smoke specially blended herbs through a thin pipe as a kind of reproductive tonic. Court physicians even prescribed tobacco tea for melancholy, and tobacco enemas weren't strictly European territory either, though no one anywhere recorded them as pleasurable. Bless their thorough if misguided optimism. The most curious of these practices involved tobacco being combined with rose oil and saffron, heated gently and used to scent dressing rooms, a calming vapor, allegedly. Whether it calmed the nerves or merely caused spontaneous sneezing tantrums remains a mystery. What is certain is that the guests who emerged from these tobacco-infused steams often reported feeling clearer-headed, thoroughly scrubbed, and slightly buzzed. Interestingly, while most of Europe regarded the Ottomans as exotic smokers, by the mid-1600s, the sultans began cracking down on tobacco use. Sultan Murad IV, in particular, couldn't stand the stuff. He issued sweeping bans, and legend has it that he would patrol the streets in disguise, executing those caught mid-puff, a risky time to exhale. This created quite the predicament for bathhouses and their clients. Some adapted by switching to herbal substitutes like dried lavender or crushed bay leaves. Others simply got better at ventilating their steam rooms and bribing the local authorities with, say, a first-rate bar of lemon soap. Eventually, as the tobacco craze waned from its medicinal pedestal, its use in bathhouses evolved into something more recreational. The fantasy of it as a cleansing elixir faded, but the slow, spiraling smoke remained, curling upward like a sleepy spell, mingling with the steam and secrets behind the hammam stone walls. And so, nestled in the tiled serenity of empire, tobacco carried on its smoky little charade, beloved, prohibited, inhaled, bathed with, and always just a bit misunderstood. Somewhere beyond those misty halls, tobacco was preparing for its next transformation, away from the spa and into a far colder element. The story, as it happens, would drift northward, towards snow, frost, and a pipe-smoking Russian Tsar with grand ideas and suspiciously warm gloves. Let's follow the smoke, the curious case of tobacco gargles, and the cough that never left picture it. A dainty boudoir in 18th century Paris, sunlight filtering lazily through lace curtains, and on the vanity table, nestled between rosewater and powdered wigs, a delicate bottle labelled Elixir de Nicotien pour la gorge. Yes, tobacco throat rinse, infused with the finest sun-dried leaves of Nicotiana tabacum, designed, according to contemporary wisdom, to calm an irritated gullet, sweeten the breath, and, if needed, frighten away ghosts. Maybe. You might imagine coughing politely into lace handkerchiefs, then tenderly swishing a solution that, in today's terms, might be comparable to rinsing your throat with a chimney. Back then, the throat gargle was no mere afterthought. It was a lively participant in the world of domestic medicine. Tobacco-infused solutions were used to relieve sore throats, hoarseness, and even melancholia. If you'd sung too loud at last night's harpsichord ballad recital, or found yourself low of spirits, someone would surely offer you a spoonful of warm tobacco rinse and suggest you breathe deeply through your left nostril. Now, modern physicians might sweat slightly at the idea of soaking one's vocal cords with ash water infusion. But in the 1700s, the tobacco gargle was seen as much safer than, say, leeches, or being surprised by a barber surgeon wielding a suspiciously blunt tooth key. The concept of smoke and fumes being medicinal was already entrenched. After all, for centuries people had been placing smouldering herbs under the noses of patients suffering chest vapors or inflammations of the phlegmatic disposition. Tobacco, being relatively new and thrillingly exotic, simply joined the chorus line of things thought to banish bad humours. With enough of it, one could cure just about anything except common sense. The English, being English, took to the practice with their usual mix of solemnity and stubborn resolve. In 1676, one physician wrote enthusiastically that tobacco water was singularly powerful against putrid sore throats, and recommended it be gargled every morning, even by the healthy. As a preventative, he wrote seriously, though one imagines with a mouth that constantly tasted like baked fireplace. Of course, there were drawbacks. Some people gargled too vigorously and ended up introducing tobacco juice into less welcoming parts of their anatomy. A hospital in Aberdeen once scrambled after a patient inhaled his gargle by accident and then insisted he could taste smoke for 3 days. He whispered, confidentially, that he feared his lungs were now on fire. The nurse dismissed it as nerves and handed him a warm mug of tobacco tea instead. He was never heard from again, but his shoes remained. Children, too, were not exempt. Tobacco rinses were occasionally used to calm young ones with sore throats or excessive complaintiveness. Some frustrated parents even administered tobacco enemas. Yes, that was a thing. Yes, it was unfortunate. Hoping to revive a faint child or discourage disobedience. Clearly, parenting manuals were not yet a flourishing genre. Surprisingly, despite tasting like burnt toast kissed by regret, the tobacco gargle stuck around for quite some time. It was listed in several official pharmacopoeias and could be purchased at apothecaries across Europe. When mixed with ruby-coloured wine and delivered in cut glass bottles, it even enjoyed a brief career as a fashionable hostess gift. Monsieur Dubois brought me chamomile soaps, and dear Madame Leclerc sent this delightful tobacco rinse. It smells like revolution and large dogs. A peculiar practice emerged among opera singers who believed gargling tobacco water made the voice more profound and resonant. There are accounts of contraltos performing entire arias with a subtle hint of campfire trailing behind every high note. Audiences, unsure whether to applaud or sigh in concern, opted for both. But like many questionable trends, powdered wigs, mercury pills, and those trousers with the unsettlingly high waist, the tobacco gargle eventually faded. As the 19th century rolled in with its sniffly handkerchiefs and cough lozenges, people began to view nicotine not so much as a gentle throat hug, but rather a slightly aggressive lodger overstaying its welcome in the lungs. Even so, the echoes remain. In certain dusty corners of antique pharmacies, you might still find an amber bottle etched with fading Latin and the confident label, ad gurgitandum cum nicotiana. Just don't try it, or if you must, don't inhale. And as the smoke of centuries lazily drifts from your imagination, we'll tiptoe softly onward, toward the strange tale of smoking ladies, scented cigars, and why Victorian women were encouraged to puff for proper posture. A surgeon's pocket and the smoke of progress. In the quiet corners of 17th century Europe, where candle wax lingered softly on oakwood cupboards and the scent of salted meats perfumed chilly drawing rooms, surgeons walked about with the strangest accessories. In addition to lancets, forceps, and jolly little saws, many carried a curious contraption known affectionately as a tobacco clayster, which, yes, is as gloriously strange as it sounds. Now, don't let the word clister fool you into thinking this device was anything but oddly specific. It was, in its essence, a smoke enema kit, a delicate tool for introducing tobacco smoke via the posterior regions, for medical purposes, of course. Yes, indeed, in an era before antibiotics, when leeches were still considered charming dinner guests in the operating room, blowing smoke into one's nether parts was not only acceptable, it was encouraged. Soothingly encouraged. You may wonder who thought this up. Who, in the theatre of wild invention, gazed upon a tobacco pipe and thought, what this needs is more rear access. The story begins with the budding belief that tobacco was, quite genuinely, capable of reviving the dead, or at the very least, the mostly dead. In England, especially, these pipes of questionable dignity were used in attempts to resuscitate drowning victims. Along the River Thames, a network of resuscitation stations was installed, tiny wooden huts housing emergency tobacco bellows, ready to deliver an airy blessing to any soggy passerby pulled from the murky water. Quick, one might imagine a soggy gentleman gasping between sputters. Fetch the enema pipe. The thinking, you see, was that tobacco, being warming, stimulating, and the darling of Elizabethan science, could stir the vital humours of the body, awaken sluggish organs, and most crucially, drive out cold and dampness from the posterior gateway to the soul, which, in medical Latin, was something like very official soundings. These tobacco bellows were usually operated by someone nearby, perhaps a local riverman, or a robust barmaid with upper arm strength born of years hoisting smoky ales. A tube was inserted gently into the patient's hindquarters, and tobacco smoke was puffed in with deep Victorian sincerity. If the first puff didn't bring them back, well, keep puffing. Science. Naturally, this sparked a robust economy for travelling enema kits, complete with miniature bellows, rubber tubes, and flattering engravings to explain how progressive the whole thing was. Surgeons' instruments catalogues even included price points and handling instructions. Though if you've ever tried to take medical advice from a 1692 pamphlet, you'll know it's mostly bloodletting diagrams and the odd woodcut of a man exclaiming delight mid-enema. Stranger still was the introduction of these ideas into polite households. Imagine Aunt Penelope, always prepared, keeping a brass clyster set hanging modestly near the fireplace, just in case Uncle Cornelius had one of his fainting spells. It wasn't just about revival, it was fashionably healthful. The same way today we might drink vitamin water or do yoga near a salt lamp made of Himalayan daydreams. One by one, European courts and country doctors adopted tobacco as the miracle assistant of resuscitation efforts. The French, with their flair for drama, occasionally insisted on flavoured tobacco. Clove or lavender, perhaps. A delicate touch if you're delivering smoke to one's most delicate of places. But, dear listener, as with all delightful illusions, the age of the tobacco enema began to smoulder at the edges of credibility. As medical science inched toward germ theory and away from the Aristotelian drama of humours, physicians started asking awkward questions like, does this actually work? And might we try warming blankets instead of burning colonics? And just like that, puff by puff, the practice faded, though some persisted, as late as the 1810s, in believing tobacco smoke administered through any available human orifice could calm seizures, banish worms, or coax cursed children back into compliance. Modern medicine shook its collective head and rather firmly tossed the enema bellows into the ash bin of history. Yet, somewhere, amid the damp fog banks of England, it's said you can still find relics. Aged devices resting quietly in glass cabinets at forgotten medical museums. Eerily elegant, all brass and curves, like smoking pipes that lost their way and found a different kind of purpose. And with that smoky little chapter ending in the quiet hiss of history's more peculiar puff, let's gently drift onward to the next comforting corner of tobacco's tangled tale, where rumours of tobacco-fueled weather control stir beneath the powdered wigs of Enlightenment gentlemen, the smoky sanctums of social medicine. A wrinkled page in the dusty annals of history invites us into the drawing rooms, apothecaries, and diplomatic salons of the 1600s, where tobacco's plume drifted and curled like a sociable ghost. Long before smoke-filled rooms were synonymous with emergency meetings and poor ventilation, they were, in fact, thought to be healthful environments, good for your lungs, your mind, and possibly your character. This was a time when smelling sweet didn't mean lavender or lemon verbena, but a rich, earthy fog expelled politely from a silver pipe. And what better accessorizing could one do than clutching a finely carved snuff box, tapping it gently before inhaling powdered leaves through one's carefully flared nostrils? Tobacco, by now, had made itself quite at home across Europe. Its early novelty had matured into social prestige, and physicians, eager as ever not to be left out of any profitable confusion, were penning treatises faster than you could say incipient phlegm. One particularly zealous fellow was Dr. Tobias Venner, a 17th century physician from Bath, who considered tobacco a good friend to the brain, but also stressed it was not to be abused. His balancing act was rather like saying cake is wonderful for health, if only you eat it with a fork made of restraint. Dr. Venner warned against pipe smoking in excess, but recommended it for certain vital purposes, such as digestion, mental clarity, and, obviously, social altitude. Tobacco had by then wafted into the elegant atmosphere of the salons, those glittering hubs of fashionable intellect. French elite puffed contemplatively between arguments about art and the human soul. In Spain, tobacco leaves were placed in the shoes of the well-heeled to ward against foot odours and misfortune. And in England, the social smokers were rising. They called it taking the air, as if the air needed to be smoked before it was fit for polite inhaling. Snuff, in particular, emerged as the era's preferred nose candy. Carried daintily in ornate boxes, it was shared before meals, after scandal, and during boredom. Entire rituals bloomed around the gentle act of offering snuff. A gentleman would flick open his box, present it with a dry nod, and wait to see if his acquaintance accepted or declined. Accepting meant good company. Declining, well, one might as well excuse themselves to cough into irrelevance. Little did they know, behind all the polished presentation and puffed sophistication, a few brave lungs were already wondering whether this miracle cure also came with a curse. Of course, not everyone caught the smoky excitement. King James I of England, who had a quill for drama and a nose for discomfort, famously wrote a counterblast to tobacco in 1604, a wonderfully named pamphlet denouncing the plant as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. King James spared no adjectives in his disdain for the leafy newcomer, comparing smokers to the primeval devils of sulphur and fire. In hindsight, it reads less like a public health concern and more like a man personally betrayed by a houseplant. Yet, fascinatingly, despite royal rebuke and ecclesiastic warnings, the combustible charm of tobacco rose like smoke through keyholes and around laws. The elite turned it into a social institution. The sick turned to it for relief. And nearly everyone, everywhere, agreed that if it made you sneeze or sweat, that must mean it's working. Across Turkey, the Middle East, and into Asia, its use morphed into local customs. In Japan, samurai were known to carry elegant tobacco pouches, and in India, hookahs began a long and decorative journey toward becoming divine symbols of domestic relaxation. A misty thread now linked continents, not just by trade, but by belief, that this bitter plant was somehow sweet for the body and soothed the soul, especially when presented with a dash of ceremony and a teaspoon of peer pressure. And so, as the 17th century drifted by under a grey sky of smoke rings and royal disapproval, the world swayed between cure and curiosity. In drawing rooms and barracks, in boudoirs and back alleys, tobacco was reaching far beyond medicine. It was becoming culture. A prickly, spicy, potentially ruinous kind of culture, yes. But isn't that what makes history clog so pleasantly into the nostrils? As the scent of burning leaves trails off into evening breezes and flickering candlelight, let us follow it into one of the strangest innovations of all. A room, sealed and sacred, built specifically for the purpose of smoking the sick back to life. The most relaxed plague doctor in Paris. Imagine Paris in the 1600s, wrapped in a haze of pipe smoke, perfume, and questionable medical credentials. The cobblestone streets echo with the clip-clop of hooves and the occasional hiccup of a cart vendor who's had too much warm ale. And somewhere, nestled between a leaky brothel and a candle shop that smells suspiciously of turnips, sits a modest apothecary. Inside, a man in a bird-faced mask stirs dried lavender into pipe tobacco and declares, in a tone of complete conviction, that this will ward off the bubonic plague. Ah yes, here we meet one of the oddest and most dreamlike chapters in tobacco's medical masquerade. The plague doctor of Paris, who believed that stuffing aromatic tobacco into one's beak nose and puffing it obediently kept the Black Death at bay. These were professionals, men whose primary certifications seemed to be somewhat available during outbreaks. In those misty days of marginal hygiene and maximal flair, the miasma theory ruled the scene. That's the idea that diseases were caused not by germs. Oh no, that knowledge hadn't RSVP'd to the party yet, but by bad air, nasty breezes, evil humours that floated through space like grumpy aromas. To shield themselves from this malevolent air, plague doctors wore long robes and leather gloves, and tucked their faces into masks shaped like predatory toucans on holiday. The beaks weren't just decorative. They were stuffed with herbs and dried tobacco leaves, a sort of nasal potpourri designed to filter out the sinister vapors. Some doctors even prescribed tobacco enemas. Yes, you heard that right, and I do wish you hadn't. The idea was simple, if not wholesome. If smoking it gave vitality to the chest, perhaps puffing it the other way gave strength to the soul. I promise, this is real history and not an elaborate Victorian prank. In France, state-sponsored physicians, an ominous phrase to be sure, recommended that citizens light up a pipe in public gatherings to cleanse the air. Picture a Paris salon in 1641. Philosophers, poets, and a very confused rooster all puffing away dramatically while arguing about the nature of truth and whether tobacco is a gift from the gods or just particularly fragrant luck. Meanwhile, children in some English schools were reportedly punished not for smoking, but for refusing to. Queen Elizabeth's court physicians believed early tobacco use would straighten the lungs and fortify the spirits. Students of the time might have failed Latin, but their lungs were apparently ironclad. There's an eerie comfort in the poetry of human error. The idea that long before we understood bacteria or viruses, people still tried to fight off pandemic panic with style, rituals, and aggressive leaf-based solutions. The beak masks, the smoky chambers, the belief that tobacco could conquer death, all of it reads less like medical history and more like a half-remembered fever dream narrated by a slightly tipsy librarian. And yet, somewhere in the layers of soot and superstition, there was genuine hope, a need to find control in the uncontrollable, to light a pipe and believe, if only briefly, that you were one puff away from safety, one whiff from salvation. As the fireflies flickered beyond the Seine, and the chimneys of sleepy Paris gave their tobacco-tinged sighs, the plague doctors would retreat to their candle-lit rooms, remove their bird masks, and perhaps, just perhaps, wonder if the smoke was doing anything at all. But they dared not say it aloud. Outside, church bells tolled, lovers whispered under cloaks, and the air, bad or good, drifted onward. And now, as our tobacco-scented journey continues, we'll wander into the minds of Enlightenment thinkers who tried to make sense of all this with logic, pamphlets, and an alarming variety of powdered wigs. A cloud of perfume smoke. As the 17th century sighed into the 18th like an old man settling into his favorite chair, tobacco had become not only fashionable, but fragrant. Truly, few other plants have ever been so vigorously misunderstood and stylishly over-advertised. Far from the early fears of devilish vapors, the aroma of tobacco smoke was now considered not just tolerable, but positively desirable. We find ourselves drifting now into perfume parlors and bustling apothecaries, where whiffs of tobacco swirled sweetly through the air. During these golden-hued decades, smoking was promoted as a hygienic practice. Yes, you heard right. Hygienic. The pungent curls of pipe smoke weren't just there to satisfy cravings or accommodate social posturing. They were believed to cleanse the very air of disease. In London, physicians scrawled out prescriptions less for leeches and more for long-stemmed pipes. If you were a gentleman nursing a nervous disposition or a merchant worried about the latest bout of plague, a well-packed bowl of Virginia's finest was deemed a solid defense. Tobacco was practically a vaccination in vapor form. And because medical knowledge of the time operated smoothly within the realm of creative guesswork, some doctors, not fringe ones mind you, but the scholarly sort with wigs and Latin degrees, insisted that tobacco smoke could repel illnesses just by being in the room. The idea was that it would chase away bad air, or miasma, the invisible menace thought responsible for diseases before germ theory finally put on its glasses. Hospitals even took part in the smoke show. Tobacco was burned like incense in sick wards. It was pumped into rooms with the kind of enthusiastic confidence one usually reserves for floodlights or bug spray. One vivid London hospital in 1720 kept a designated smoking room, which wasn't for unwinding, but for disinfecting the air with beneficial fumes. Imagine trying to recover from a fever while your lungs filled with the aromatic embrace of 20 smouldering pipes nearby. So comforting. For households hoping to keep their families alive and their curtains char-smudged. Tobacco smouldered in little braziers beside beds. Among the more inventive gadgets was the tobacco smoke enema kit, a medical contraption so deeply ridiculous it deserves a moment of recognition. Yes, tobacco smoke was not only inhaled, but also introduced through, shall we say, unconventional entrances. If someone had fallen into icy water and collapsed from hypothermia, a helpful bystander might retrieve a smoke enema kit, a flexible tube, a nozzle, and a bellows, and proceed to inflate their unconscious companion from behind like a morbid balloon animal. This will revive them, folklore insisted confidently. To be fair, it occasionally worked, not because of the tobacco, but because the physical activity involved in the procedure sometimes helped stimulate breath or warmth. Still, it's hard not to imagine a poor sailor regaining consciousness to the sound of someone cheerfully operating bellows and saying, "You'll feel right as rain in 5 puffs." The royal societies of Europe were in no hurry to dismiss such practices. After all, these strange measures were supported by the hum of progress, or what passed for it in a powdered wig century. In Parisian circles, smoking was practiced with a mixture of flair and suspicion. Smoking jackets and embroidered pipe bags became fashionable accessories, while elaborate snuff boxes glinted delicately from silk waistcoat pockets. Snuff, powdered tobacco snorted delicately and with theatrical elan, was particularly popular among courtiers and composers who wished to keep their lungs free for operatic sighing and minor scandals. Some formulations were scented with violets or cloves, and sniffing snuff became almost a social language of its own. Bold inhalers, shy dabbers, and those who dramatically sneezed 3 times in perfect succession, like a sneeze haiku. Meanwhile, in smoky taverns under creaking oak beams, stories swirled with the mist. Sailors swapped tales of foreign ports, where tobacco cured everything from melancholy to mysterious rashes. Apothecaries sold custom blends said to restore virility, banish sleeplessness, or calm a quarrelsome wife, though the last presumably carried a refund policy. All of this happened beneath the long sigh of candlelight and the creak of wooden floorboards, as the world kept turning its leafy brown addiction into poetry, therapy, and occasional hilarity. And now, dear dreamer, with the smoke curling low and the snuff boxes closed for the night, we'll follow the last tendrils as they drift lazily into the next room, where tobacco loses its golden glow and the winds of change begin to blow. The soft ashes of a smoky empire. Somewhere in the quiet archive of your mind, a curious question drifts like the last tendrils of a cigar in an open window. Whatever happened to all those tobacco tonics, snuffs, syrups, and time-honored inhale soot tinctures that claim to cure everything short of taxes? Well, darling listener, tonight we let the smoke clear, not with a bang, but with an exhale. By the late 19th century, even amidst the top hats and tea cakes of Victorian civility, the enthusiasm for tobacco as a medical marvel began to, how shall we say it, cough politely. Yes, doctors were slowly starting to suspect that perhaps encouraging your patients to puff on rolled-up rainforest might not be the most sustainable long-term prognosis. A French physician in the 1860s wrote, with tragic hesitation, that tobacco might, just might, be a danger when implemented without restraint. That's Victorian for oops. Meanwhile, German scientists, powered by strong coffee and stronger mustaches, began peering into the makeup of nicotine with a skeptical eye and an alarming number of test rabbits. Their notes were filled with odd phrases like possible excitability of the medulla oblongata and patient combusted gently. Back in England, the same empire that once handed out tobacco to schoolboys to strengthen their lungs, was beginning to host debates in polite medical societies about whether smoke in the thorax might not be heaven's finest idea after all, which was quite the pivot, considering 2 decades earlier they were lacing infant teething drops with nicotine and calling it sleepy baby elixir. History. It never learned to read the dosage. But let's not blame them too harshly. The age of quackery had been a swirling carnival tent full of pickled frog hearts and electric hairbrushes, and tobacco had simply taken center stage for a long, smoky encore. By the dawn of the 20th century, the clouds began to thin. Smoky treatments were falling out of favor, replaced by new scientific gadgets that beeped, glowed, or at least didn't ignite. Tobacco's hallowed role as a curative was quietly erased from the textbooks, much like one politely removes an embarrassing uncle from a family portrait. By the 1930s, the healing halo once floating gently above the fine-leafed plant had withered. Tobacco had shifted fully into what we might call its cool but problematic film noir phase. No longer sold in apothecaries next to licorice roots and laudanum drops, it was now found clutched between the immaculate fingers of Hollywood protagonists who could solve a murder with nothing but a half-lit cigarette and a traumatic backstory. The miracle cure had become a marketing icon. But here's the twisty, restful part. Even as the science turned solemn, as lungs were x-rayed and posters were hung warning children not to take up the glamorous doomstick, tobacco never entirely disappeared. Like a stubborn ghost at an Edwardian dinner party, it lingered. Societies shifted, medicine matured. But the myth of tobacco's golden age, the era when smoke was medicine and doctors signed prescriptions with cigar ash on their cuffs, that remained, tucked away in old ads, thicker than molasses hair tonic, and just about as reliable. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to soften at the edges, think of those antique tobacconists with their mahogany counters and velvet waistcoats, briskly grinding leaves into tonic with the conviction of alchemists. Picture the village barber who offered a quick shave, a splash of bay rum, and a cheeky puff of curative smoke for the nerves. Imagine the lady of the manor partaking of a snuff box shaped like a hedgehog, sniffing for sinus health and social flair. History is sometimes silly, often strange, and frequently covered in soot. But the people who lived it were just like us, curious, hopeful, and a little too eager to rub burning leaves on everything. And isn't there something oddly comforting in that? Even if it means your great-great-grandfather once tried to cure his sore throat with a pipe and 3 prayers. So tonight, dear sleeper, let the echoes of smoky apothecaries fade into the hush of starlight. Lay back, inhale nothing, exhale everything, and drift into a dream where cigars heal heartbreak, where pipes puff away the plague, and where history, no matter how ridiculous, always ends in a whisper.